Good morning. One more time. It's Friday, y'all. Come on. Good morning. Yeah. Here at the main inclusion conference. Oh my God. Why am I hearing somebody else? You came to hear us. Oh, yeah, I know, right? I wonder if that good morning was just really extra special for them. Okay, we're talking to them. Well, I'm going to talk to you then. We'll do the housekeeping stuff while they talk over there. One thing that we wanted to mention, and I'm just going to read it verbatim so you all get the information. First, please visit the exhibitors through lunch in all three sections. And then we will give instructions again on lunch, but Salon C will use the buffet in the hallway, and Salon A, B, C, and D will head towards registration to line up for Casco Bay lunch buffet. Did y'all get that? Good. All right, I'm not done yet. Signage will be posted on the doors of the breakout rooms. There will be a survey shared after the conference. Please let us know what you think. Got it all? All right, then let's get to the real good stuff. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm going to allow both of my colleagues to introduce themselves, but we're going to start right off over here.
All right, thanks so much. My name is Liz Greason, and I am the founder of Waypoint Intercultural. This is presenting quite a challenge to my brain to be talking and listening to someone else speaking. So I'm just going to make that visible right now. Today, I'll be talking a little bit about something called intercultural competence and intercultural development and its impact on workplace inclusivity. And I will turn it over to Tara to introduce herself.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Tara Jenkins. I'm the founder of an organization called Conscious Revolution, and we do all sorts of organizational development, human resources, and leadership work with leaders and organizations, and do a lot of work around equity and inclusion inside organizations. So really excited to be here with all of you today.
And I'll introduce myself while there's no voice that's hovering over me. Dustin Ward, founder of It Is Time. Main tenet is we look to end racism in all communities throughout Maine. And so we hope we're progressing towards that each and every day, but pleasure to be here.
All right, and so now that we don't have competing voices, we're going to dive into the content of this session. And oh, it's even here already. I love it. Okay, before we start talking about workplace inclusivity, we want to start by doing something that has seemingly nothing to do with the workplace or with inclusivity. But if you would just hang with me for a moment while we go there. I want you to grab a pen and a piece of paper. There are a couple. If you don't have something handy, there are a couple things at the center of the table. If you want to grab a pen from there, a piece of paper from there. It does require a pen and a piece of paper. That's not something you can do on your phone or online. Sorry, old school. A difference that's making a difference here is generation, right? The assumption that people might have a pen. Well, but I did put some pens on the table in case we didn't, right? All right. So does everyone have a pen in their hand? Yeah, you got your pen? All right, go ahead and switch that to the other hand. Oh, rough for Friday morning.
They're on to us.
I know, they are, right? And I would love for you to just go ahead and write this sentence, or do your best. I am writing with my non-dominant hand. Oh, they hate me already. I'm writing with my non-dominant hand. Once you're finished with that, I'd love for you to give your signature a try. I just heard, this is terrible. And lastly, go ahead and write today's date. I think it's the 3rd. Does that sound right? May 3rd? In whatever way you'd like to write it. I'm eavesdropping and I hear, I'm proud of myself. I heard someone else say, this is really hard. I'm curious, what awkward. Yeah, I'm curious, what was that experience like? You can either kind of shout out or raise a hand. Not easy. Awkward. Uncomfortable. Frustrating. Say again. Slow. Maybe took some extra energy. Yeah. Maybe part of your brain was having to concentrate on that and being distracted from, maybe you couldn't remember how to spell dominant. And that kind of became more difficult as you were kind of trying to remember that. What if you had to do this for the rest of the day? Oh, it would be tiring. Yeah. What else? Say again. Oops, I can't hear what you're saying. Maybe with time we would get better with practice. Yeah. Which kind of brings us to our next question. What if you had to do this for the rest of your life? You'd get better. Yeah, you'd get better. But it's still going to be exhausting. Yes. Okay. There will probably be this extra effort and energy and level of discomfort, perhaps. Yeah. And kind of taking this a little bit further, what assumptions might someone make about you if they were looking just at you writing with your non-dominant hand? That you're slow. People might get impatient with you. That you're less capable, right? That they might believe that this is indicative of your ability, right? Yeah. So people might make some inaccurate assumptions when you are operating from this non-dominant space. We already kind of touched on some of the what challenges did you encounter? I heard people say it was slow, it was exhausting. I don't know if there's anything else people wanted to make visible about the challenge. You wanted to write all your letters backwards. There was something going on in your brain. I'm seeing some other nods. Yeah, so the process and the content, this extra brain power that you weren't able to kind of go on automatic pilot, right? You were having to kind of have this almost meta awareness of this other factor. Which brings us to thinking about what support might you need. Maybe some extra time. Say again. A dictation tool. Yeah, some kind of adaptive technology system, right? Patience. Okay, some patience, perhaps some curiosity to make us question. Maybe there's more to the story, to the point about the assumptions, right? Maybe there's more going on here. Maybe this isn't indicative of the full story, what I see here, what I'm looking at. And so how might this activity that seemingly has nothing to do with workplace inclusivity, how might this start to tap into workplace inclusivity? What might it get you thinking about it? Yeah. Applications. Can you say a little bit more about that? Okay. So thinking about the application process at our workplaces, who was it designed? Who was in mind when it was designed? All right. Thinking about translation tools, thinking about why is the written word so primary in our workplace culture? I mean, really, if it's not written down, right, it doesn't exist in the dominant American workplace culture. Now, I, having lived in the Middle East, know that there, if it's written down, that indicates that there was actually not a level of trust. Why don't you just trust my word, Liz? Why'd you have to write that down? And so again, these differences that perhaps we don't even realize are having us have that second awareness, that meta awareness might be at play. Anything else come up for folks as you think about how this activity may tie into workplace inclusivity? Yeah, so not only difference linguistically, but even in communication strategies. Do we communicate in a very direct way? Do we communicate in a more indirect way? Do we put as primary our relationship, or do we put as primary the task at hand? Right? Often in dominant American culture, we're putting the task at hand where there's this assumed trust and relationship built. But in most of the rest of the world, that's actually not the case. I remember my time living in Dubai, my students, I taught at the American University in Dubai, one of the first things they'd say to me in the morning, "How is your family, Professor Greason?" And I'm like, "I'm single, I live in the Middle East, I'm by myself, I'm having a great time," and they're like, "Oh, that's so very sad. It's so very sad." But I mean, it's a kind of a making light of it. But these are some great comments. I didn't know if any of my, I'm kind of putting you on the spot here. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add in terms of how you folks see this activity tying into workplace inclusivity.
As you were sharing your story, Liz, I was reflecting on living in the Netherlands and Europe for a while, and the appreciation I had of being in that culture and a different language, different customs, in the same way that you were talking about different cultures, and my real lack of appreciation initially when I got there for all of those nuances. And I often think about that every day when I'm seeing people from other places living all of us together here and thinking about the hurdles that they have to overcome. And I think of like systems 1 and systems 2 thinking. If people are familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow, he unfortunately just passed away, but he has amazing work around how we think. And I think the exercise that you just did with writing with your non-dominant hand is really an example of relying on systems 2 thinking and how exhausting that can be, and just how much we need to appreciate and have gratitude for people who are trying to do that every single day.
Dustin, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think I wrote down all the things that you all said, and I want you to think about this. Will transition to what I'll say at some point, but points to capability: less capable, exhausting, frustrating, extra energy. How to learn to engage in that non-dominant mindset, but practice living in dominant spaces. Thinking about process. Just as someone who enters in as that non-dominant voice or as that non-dominant individual, those are the feelings that I may have or many others have had on a consistent basis. So the things that you just described with this activity of what you felt with just your hand are the actual emotional feelings that when you enter into a workspace can be how people feel. So I think the activity, if you take it from just the actual activity of doing it with your hand to thinking about an individual and a human who enters in, you can feel exhausted. You can feel frustrated because you are not that non-dominant voice, or you're a marginalized voice in that dominant space. So consider that as sort of the additional, that's what comes to mind for me as I sort of hear the response to the activity.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, both of you. And this is really absolutely trying to get at that point of dominant group membership, non-dominant group membership, because generally speaking, there are all these differences that make a difference. We can think about this as aspects of identity, aspects of diversity, and typically, depending upon our memberships, we may be part of a dominant group or part of a non-dominant group. Many of us embody both, actually, right? Many of us have both dominant group memberships and non-dominant group memberships. And so to kind of further this point that Dustin was talking about in terms of entering into a workplace, I'm sure there are many of us in this room who may have been sitting around a table, for example, and said, you know what, not even worth it for me to bring up my perspective here. They're not going to listen. Chances are in that moment, you were probably operating from a non-dominant group identity. That was the identity that was rising to the surface in that moment. Now, that's not always going to be the identity that's rising to the surface. And these differ depending upon context. Just in terms of this image here that we at Waypoint have put together, this generally kind of goes from those things that are less changeable over time to more changeable over time. And which is not to say that each of these have the same level of importance. Again, they rise and fall depending upon context. And obviously, particularly in our current American culture, things like race, things like political affiliation and religious affiliation even right now is rising to the top, particularly around Israel and Palestine. So what my work at Waypoint generally focuses on is exploring and understanding better how we as individuals and organizations are navigating these differences that make a difference. And the way that we respond to difference can be quantified and measured by something called the Intercultural Development Inventory, which forms the basis of much of our work at Waypoint. And what that does is that quantifies an individual and/or an organization according to this continuum. And I'm going to talk briefly about each of these orientations. And so everyone in this room is somewhere along this continuum. We're either in denial, where we're missing difference, or you may be working with someone who says, I don't really see why we got to do all this DEI stuff. Like, this is a performance issue. This is just an individual problem. That person's just doesn't fit into our culture. Right? That person's not a culture fit. So these are some things that people might say who are in denial. From denial, we move on to polarization. Us versus them, good versus bad. My culture's good, your culture's bad. Now that you're here, let's do it this way. This is just the normal thing to do, right? This is just the right thing to do. This is just good business. Really not seeing complexity. Polarization is the orientation of people who are certain. If people are really digging in about being right, chances they're in polarization. There's also another interesting manifestation of polarization, which is polarization reversal. This often happens as a coping strategy for those of us who are members of non-dominant groups, where we start to actually disparage or hate part of our own identity and take on the values of the dominant group identity. And so again, often as a survival strategy for a pretty traumatic event. Polarization is often a response to pain, no matter what way it's manifesting. Minimization is the de-emphasis of difference, and this is by and large where most clients that I work with start at, most individuals as well, where there is the de-emphasis of difference. Let's not, when we were talking about difference, that was really stressful. Let's not do that. Let's just focus on what we have in common. Let's create common policies that treat everybody the same. But wait a second, who's designing those policies? Members of dominant groups who might not see that it's landing inequitably, but it feels good to me. Minimization feels really good to dominant group members, which is why some of you may be encountering resistance as you try to enact DEI efforts, because the people who are members of dominant groups in positions of power are like, hey, this is good. We got policies that treat everyone the same, and I feel good, so everyone's good. Many of us in this room know that's not true, right? That's not, it's not. And as Tara is going to talk about later on in the session, the difference between equity and equality. Minimization is all about equality with a blind spot around your bias, which is more what Dustin's going to be talking about. Sorry, did you say something? Oh, I'm hallucinating, apparently, so don't mind me. Minimization can also manifest in non-dominant groups by going along to get along. Remember when I just mentioned that thing about sitting at a table and being like, you know what, not even friggin' worth it. That is a going along to get along because you know that your difference isn't welcome. You know it's just going to be disparaged, ignored, or you're going to be seen as the problem for bringing it up, not the problem that you're trying to bring up. The individualization versus the looking at the systemic biases and inequity. From minimization, we go on to the acceptance mindset, which is more of an intercultural mindset, where there is the deep understanding of difference. Acceptance is a bit of a misnomer. It's not that we accept everything about every culture all the time, but it's you deeply understand the why. And you also deeply understand your own cultural self, the reason that you may be responding or seeing something the way you see it. As we were talking about, or as Tara mentioned, in terms of when she was in the Netherlands, things that just seem like the way things are done. Wait a second, it's done totally differently there. Or when I was in Dubai, totally different. And so there's that awareness of our own cultural lenses. So that's a lot of the work to get out of minimization and into acceptance. And then finally, we get to adaptation, where we're able to put things into action. Adaptation is the mindset and the orientation of action. And here's the problem with a lot of DEI work, in my opinion, this is my bias, is that recommendations are coming from a place of adaptation and the leadership is in minimization. And then we're wondering why the hell nothing's working. And so part of the work that we do at Waypoint is to meet those leaders and those organizations where they are, which is typically minimization, and provide the training, support, facilitation to get people, leaders' mindsets into a place that they're actually able to enact these equitable, excellent policies that people are recommending. You'd tell me if I was starting to go on too much.
I was about to. But it felt like that was it. Like that was a great spot to end. I don't know.
Did you want me to talk about the impact on non-dominant groups though?
It's up to you. It's very
To set you up. Shit, I have been on for a while. Huh? All right, I'll be quick. I promise. Okay. Quickly, as I promised. Okay, so just in terms of a definition of intercultural competence, remember that I was talking about the cultural self-awareness, the cultural other awareness, and essentially our capacity to shift our perspective and behavior based on understanding cultures and individuals with greater levels of complexity. And when we're saying cultures here, we're meaning those differences that are making a difference, and greater levels of complexity are absolutely understanding the power dynamics that go along with dominant and non-dominant groups. In terms of how it fits into in terms of how intercultural competence fits into diversity and inclusion, if we're talking about diversity being the mix of differences and inclusion being that mix feeling valued and engaged, intercultural competence is the how. It is the capacity. It is the mindset. And without intercultural competence, inclusion can't happen. Often we think diversity plus being really nice, really meaning well, is going to get us to inclusion, but it's not, because we need to build our capacity to be able to navigate difference from a place of complexity and understanding. Real quick, the reason that we need to do this is because research indicates, and my own experience doing this confirms, that where an individual leader or an organization is will determine the experience of non-dominant group members. And so in denial, non-dominant group members will feel ignored. In polarization, non-dominant groups will feel uncomfortable and threatened. In minimization, non-dominant groups will feel unheard. And it's not until we get to the intercultural mindset of acceptance and adaptation that non-dominant group members will start to feel valued and then finally engaged. And this is why it is so important to be building our capacity to effectively navigate difference. Because as long as our organizations are operating from minimization or earlier, non-dominant group members are going to consistently feeling unheard at best and threatened or ignored at worst. And now I promise I'm going to be quiet. Over to Dustin.
No, don't be quiet. I really appreciate you sort of setting up. What I'm going to do is try to take off from there and maybe plug in a couple of pieces. One, about my own experience, but also two, regarding sort of that actionable step as you get into that intercultural reality. There's a couple things you said there that also echo on what I believe is highly important. You mind if I'm going to crowd your space a little bit, right? I like to engage with folks. One of the biggest things that I think as I've engaged with clients over the last 4 years that the business has been, our business has been operating, is I think one of the big things is we've got to be clear on what our goals are. What is the goal? What is the purpose? And far too often when I work with organizations, we're sort of amiss. We don't really know where we want to go. And those are my favorite groups because they'll call me up and they'll say, we don't know what to do. We've got our committee, but we don't know what to do. I say, great. First step is we got to be secure and transparent about what is our goal? Where are we going? And one of the big things I want to make sure is, do we understand the difference between what DEI is, which we've been hearing, what anti-racism is, what racial equity is, and what you're trying to accomplish? So anytime I start with a group and we want to make sure that we have all those inclusive pieces and those intercultural pieces together, we've got to collectively come together and understand where are we going. So far too often, we don't have a clear goal or clear purpose. So that needs to be set in your workspace as well. Well, one other piece that came up is, how are you going to bring those intercultural pieces together? How are you going to bring groups together? One of the things, one of my two big pillars is humanity and identity. So everybody say it with me: humanity, identity. One more time: humanity, identity. If you leave here with nothing else from me, those are the two principles, two big things. And here's what I mean. Because all of what Liz just talked about, all of that cannot be reality if we do not, one, address someone's humanness, their full person. Far too often, that's where we need to begin. And when I think about that, a lot of what I bring to a lot of organizations and clients is, how do you mitigate or possibly erase the trauma and harm that is passed down from the discrimination, bullying, and hatred because there are differences, because that we are engaging with people who have diverse lived experiences and diverse opinions. Far too often, we are creating the us, them, because if we can justify that they are not human, we can actually justify violence against them, which is why we don't talk about politics in here. Because we get so divided that if you're on that side and I'm on this side, you know what, you're not even human. And I get to react a certain way to you. So for me, first thing is humanness. How can I honor you as a full individual, a full person, but also mitigate the harm and trauma we keep passing along, especially when it comes to racism in our workspaces. The second piece is the identity. If I can honor the full individual, the full person, I also need to honor the full self-identity that comes in. Can I bring my full self into a space? And here's again where we go back to that trajectory, is if I cannot bring my full self into this space, my full identity, guess what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna leave. I don't know if any of your organizations are having trouble hiring. We talked about application process, but I don't think we had a great resignation. I think we had a great reclamation or reclaiming of our identity in our workspaces. And it was because we recognized over the last 4 years that my identity is valuable. And if it is not honored in the workspace, I'm gonna go somewhere else. And ironically, what you also have seen over the last 4 years is an increase in small businesses. And that reason is because I know how I'll honor my full identity. I'll create my own business. And guess what? That's exactly what I did. Yeah. All right. Thank you. I'll give you the brief story. It may help you even, maybe you won't clap, but I've spent most of my time getting a political science degree, but then I had a call into ministry. Spent 7 years in ministry, went to get a Master of Divinity, came back here to do ministry in 2015. And it was around 2019, I got my first pastoral ministry job as a senior pastor at a church locally here in Maine. And sure enough, as we came into 2020, passing and the death of Mr. Floyd caused me to feel like it was time to bring this racial reckoning to our church. And sure enough, I wrote 3 words on a 2-page paper and gave it to my ministry board. It is time. And I explained what it was time to do. And I said that we had had enough. Enough was enough. It was time to reclaim our identity as Black and brown individuals, having watched and collectively seen what we just all saw. And sure enough, the vitriol and the toxicity that came back to me made me realize that the space was not safe. So I left. I put 7 years of ministry behind me, shut it down, and I said, okay, now I got to figure out what I'm going to do. But because of how toxic it was, because my identity and who I was not allowed into the space, I left. And what I did is I thought around for those 4 months, and I said, what can I do to bring myself into that space? How do I bring what I know and what I've experienced into this space? And so creating the business at this time was an opportunity to share some of those realities. And one of the things I want to share with you, and I'll try to give you some solution steps I want you to take as you leave here today, is how do you create, once you've got your goals and purpose, how do you create a safe space? Because that's the one thing I didn't have. I didn't know that when I stepped in with my full identity, that space was not safe. It was only after I was traumatized and harmed that I ended up realizing, wow, this is not a safe space. A couple of things I offer my clients to do to prepare that safe space. First big one is I call them norms and guidelines. I'll give you some examples, but norms and guidelines, ways in which that we are going to agree together, that we are going to engage. Far too often we lean on our personnel policies, our bylaws for our committees, other written items that don't really talk about how do we engage just interpersonally or person to person about the topics that are going on. So I call them norms and guidelines. I'll give you a couple. The one thing about these, though, is that they are co-created. So you will work with your organizations. It's not a top-down. It is everybody included. You will work together to co-collaborate them. It's a living and breathing document. It can change as the organization changes. As your organization begins to shift and move, it will shift and move with you. But it is designed so that marginalized or non-dominant voices can come into that space and say, I know this is a safe space to bring whatever it is I need to bring. So a couple that I always bring, my 6 anyways. First one is humanity over agenda. You can take that one. You can steal that one. I don't mind that. I stole it from an amazing group called MindBridge. If anybody's familiar with MindBridge, and Laura Liguori, I'm going to give her credit. She gave that to me 4 years ago, and it has stuck with me ever since. But I've explained it to people to say, you know what? As we come into our workspaces, as we have our agendas and our plans and our meetings, our humanist takes center stage. Our humanist is primary. So you may even today be coming in with phone calls you got to make, and I got 2 kids, so I'm thinking about my 2 kids in daycare. You may, have to go to the bathroom. You may need a drink. Your humanist is more important than what we have planned here. As much as we have a lot planned here, as you can see, we're just riffing. As much as that plan is important, it is more important for your humanness. And so that's why humanity over agenda. The second one I always bring is attack the problem, not the person. Far too often we personalize the issues that we have in our workspaces. And again, we personalize them, especially against non-dominant voices or marginalized voices. Oh, that one voice always bringing up this issue. Well, let's attack the problem, not the individual. There may be something about the problem of the system, as you heard. Third thing that I always bring, value the contribution that maintains people's humanity. Folks, I can't tell you how often I love opinions, but I hate opinions that dehumanize another group to be able to bring them to the forefront. So I have to draw a line, and I encourage a lot of my organizations, you need to draw that line. Most of the work that I do is with school districts. And oftentimes they don't know how to stop someone who's saying something so egregious and so harmful, especially a public comment. And so you've got to write in a line that says you can offer an opinion, but not at the detriment or the dehumanization of another group. Humanity and identity. My fourth one, speak to your experience. Folks, I know you're all well-intended. I love to hear your narratives. It's one thing I always tell a lot of my groups, share your narrative, but share your narrative. I get in these spaces and someone will go, I got a Black friend who, and I go, God almighty, that's nice, but I don't need their experience. I need your experience. Speak to your experience, the I. Your narrative is very valuable. And I'll speak again and I'll say it now. Diverse lived experiences. You all have them in this room. We are diverse in this room because we have various lived experiences. Share yours or create spaces where you can share yours. If I know that going into my engagement in a specific space, I'm going to feel a lot safer. My fifth thing, consider impact versus intent. Y'all good meaning folks, well-intended folks. It's not supposed to come across as mean, but man, it can come across as mean. Be very cautious and process and talk about when you enter in and say something, how it can be received. That's just as important as what you're saying. And be ready to be, have a little humility when you say it incorrectly. My last one, silence is both affirmative. Silence can be both positive and negative. It can be affirmative. I'll explain why. Far too often, a lot of us are internal processors. How many of you have taken 1 minute in your current meetings and just sat silent with one another? A reluctant few, yes. We are internal processors sometimes, and it's okay to be silent in those moments. Anytime I do an activity, I give folks 30 seconds at least to sort of process, okay, am I ready to speak? Do I know what I want to say? Or just to sit silently to engage in some silence. Life goes like this so fast. So that can be a positive thing. But if there was someone here today who just raised their hand and said something totally egregious and we just blew by it, pretending like it didn't happen, that's negative. That silence can be detrimental. So you need to understand that balance. Silence can be both positive and negative. Silence can be the affirmation that we have said everything that we needed to say, and that's okay. Don't feel like you need to fill the room just because it's silent. So those are my 6 I bring along to folks. If I know those 6, I can enter in and say, this is a safe space. I know we can engage together, and then you can build from there. A couple of other pieces before I turn it over to Tara that I want to sort of bring to you about, okay, how are marginalized voices or non-dominant voices going to feel like they can be safe in that space, but also how you and your organizations could take action. I use 3 pillars: learn, think, act. A couple of things that Liz was saying too, it got me thinking about, bias. And far too often we create some of that bias, one, through our colorblindness, or we begin to think, well, if we could all just be human, it'd be a lot easier. Right. Erase people's identity, that's going to make it a lot easier. And one of the things that happens is bias can enter in that way. But I usually learn, think, act. And far too often we don't learn about the history, the origins, the why. Many times if you're in your organizations, people will say, well, that's just how we did it. That's just how we're doing it. But we don't ask, why are we doing it that way? So I would encourage you to go back, learn the why, ask, why is this happening? Be okay with asking that why, which then should turn into some thinking, some empathy. If you begin to learn about the history, especially of marginalized voices, then you begin to empathize and take on that personalized lens of saying, okay, now I understand where folks are coming from. And then that creates genuine action. Far too often, especially right now, in the last 4 years of this racial reckoning, we've been in more of a performative dance, especially when it comes to DEI. To mitigate that performative dance, do the first 2. Learn, think, empathize, so that it's not just performative. We're not just doing it because it's the flavor of the month. A couple of other things. First off, I want you to be able to begin to work in your organizations about collecting voice. And in collecting voice, first thing you got to do is have collective language. Are you all talking about the same thing? Because when I go into spaces and I talk diversity, equity, inclusion, I got 16 different answers, 14 different folks, 2 managers. Are you all talking about the same things? If you have not had a clear conversation about what you mean when you say, that should be your first step. Because if you're not having collective terminology and collective language, then you're all on different pages. Other thing, I know many of you are probably either have or engaged in creating a DEI statement. How many have a DEI statement at their work right now? How many are hoping it will come? God bless you all on that journey. I don't mind DEI statements. And again, I've been labeled as someone who's in DEI. It's not originally where I started. I was in more racial equity, and it's a big difference. But a lot of what I would say is have a statement of commitment, but honestly, it's just a statement that says, this is what we are doing. This is where we're going. These are the goals. This is the vision. This is how we're getting there. If you don't have that, then if I'm someone coming into the workspace and you're saying, yeah, we're doing DEI, I'm going to be like, how? Where? What? If you, thank you. I thought that was a clap. No, it was a clap. Thanks. I was getting some hype back there. You need to be very clear about that. And I think that's highly important. Another thing, it is okay. And I think you need to honor some past traumas. I think many of us have brought in, especially marginalized non-dominant voices, we have brought in trauma from where you've previously been. And I think there needs to be a space to be able to process that, a space to honor that, a space to say, when I came in here, predominantly white space, this is how I felt. I need to know that I'm safe to be able to bring those issues up so that those fears can be lowered so that I know this is an okay space to be in. A couple of other things, because I want to make sure, I want to hear from you, Tara. I want you to be able to create advocates and allies in your workspace. Far too often, we're trying to do this all alone. And I would encourage you to begin to make a network of advocates and allies, people that you can call up, maybe not at 3 a.m. in the morning, but just call them up and say, hey, I need some help on this issue. Hey, we need to sort of bring together some defenses on this conversation. Far too often, though, when we create advocates and allies, we need to be engaging with various communities with diverse lived experiences. Far too often, we're not engaging with the very communities we're trying to impact. So my advice to you as advocates and allies should be folks who are also from marginalized communities. Get their lens, get their voice in that conversation. How are you having an advocate there as well? And finally, a couple of areas that I want you to think about impacting. We've talked about employment, so that would be including application process, interview and hiring process. When I come into an interview and I see a certain group, I'm going to start creating my own biases. So think about not just the interview and the questions, but the process for the interview. Think about the interviewing committee. Is it representative of the many lived experiences that you want to promote in your organization? Think about your working culture currently. Think about also too about your onboarding experiences. Your onboarding, is it equitable? When I come in, do I have the flexibility to maybe take a few days to sort of do this onboarding? Or are you trying to slam onboarding all in one day, which is a lot? Finally, and this should be reiterated constantly, right after you say humanity identity 100 times as you leave here, slow down and rest. If nobody's told you that today, telling you it now, slow down and take rest. Far too often, especially even now, we are trying to get back to energy from 2019 and trying to make DEI happen overnight or to make our workspaces shift overnight. This takes a long time. I work with some clients for 2 years, 2.5 years, maybe more, depending on how this year goes. All that to say is we slow down, we take our time. And I understand there's this trajectory where people begin to fizzle. They go, nothing's changing. You know what? 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, integrated schools, 1964, 1965, voting rights, civil rights legislation, a decade, 10 years before we even consider the pinnacles of what we would talk about in terms of our civil rights and racial equity movement, not to mention all of the other decades and years. It takes time. So slow down, do it right. And at the same time, take some rest. Guess what, folks? It's May, summer's in June. Take some time. You're right, I'm going on vacation. Because it's so hard to burn people out all through the year and expect them to engage when they haven't rested. So take some rest. All right, Tara, I'm going to hand it over to you.
I'm also going to come into the middle of the group. Wow, I can really see you all here. I want to actually just honor what both Liz and Dustin shared by actually just pausing and giving you all a moment before I start to jump right into my next thing, to just pause and take some notes, let something sink in that you were just thinking about. Because to what Dustin was just saying, we need to slow down. We need to slow down in our intellectual processing as well when we're in these sessions. So just going to pause for just a second. Everybody take a breath, get yourself reoriented, take a note, look around your table, smile at a friend. Realize you might have to take a bio break or get some water, take care of yourself. Sitting for an hour and a half, listening to different people, which my colleagues are amazing, but it's a lot. And also you're probably not used to sitting there listening to people for this long. So just take a moment, move around if you need to, stand up if you need to. So what we said we were going to do is provide 3 challenges. I think we have exceeded expectations with my colleagues already because we've provided a lot of challenges and a lot of solutions. Which is awesome. What we're going to talk about in this session, and this is going to be pretty participative in your tables. So I'll just, this part will go by fast because of the participation, but I'm just going to give you a warning, like you're going to talk to each other in this session, this part. And most of you, I think, like that. And particularly if you're in the line of work, I think you are, like, that's going to be just fine. We're going to differentiate between equity and equality, as Liz and Dustin mentioned in this part of the session, because it's really important. Language is really important. Definition is really important. In my experience working with clients, I can't underscore what Dustin said more emphatically around definitions and making sure that we are all have shared definitions and we understand what we're talking about. It's a real problem when that doesn't exist. So I'm going to actually ask you in your tables right now to just talk with one another about equity and equality. You may not know the difference. That's totally cool. Someone else in the table may. You're sharing and learning with each other. You're not credentialing. You're not teaching. You're just sharing what you may know, okay? Because us white folks like to do that sometimes. Here's the book I read about that, or here's the thing I did about that. No. Just share what you might know about the difference between equity and equality. And I'm going to just sort of read the room, but you just take about 5 minutes to do that. You'll get enough information together in your tables. All right, let's come back together. I'd love to keep you talking. You will get a chance to talk again about some other stuff. But I'd love to hear from the collective wisdom of this group. If someone would offer a perspective or a way to define equality, who would like to share equality?
I'll
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it,
You're
Liv.
going to take that right side, I can take the left side.
Oh, look at you.
Yeah.
We are improvising. Excellent.
Collaborative.
who has
Equality, definition of equality. Oh, right here. Great. Thank you.
we said equality was treating everyone the same.
Treating everybody the same. All right. So the same. Does anyone else want to offer like another way to think about
I
it?
peer pressure.
Oh, okay, great.
So we talked about 3 people of varying sizes trying to see over a fence, right? And the adult can, and the younger one can't, and the baby really can't. And then they all get the same size box, and the adult's like head and shoulders above, but no one else can see. So they all have to get different sizes boxes depending on how tall they are to see over the fence.
Yeah. So you have many of you seen that visual before? Yeah. I almost like said I should put it on a slide, but I was like, lots of people have already seen it. So I really appreciate you describing the visual of like that's sort of an equality. Everybody gets the same size box, right? So that's the input, same size box. Any other offers of other ways to think about it or other ways that you were defining it in your tables? Equality. All right. Yeah, probably about the same. Oh, is there somebody back there? Dustin? Oh, great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Christina over here made a wonderful point that when you look at equality, sometimes it's the fear of being discriminatory and not providing everybody the exact same.
Nice. Yeah. It might be sort of like a mitigation strategy of risk, right? But it's actually not the full picture, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But I also think about it as, and this is a nuanced way to describe some of the things you're saying, is it's equal input. Like everybody gets the same things. And so that's equal input, which can tie to maybe how we talk about equity in just a minute. Any other shares around equality?
I would just chime in that equality, that correlates with the minimization mindset that I was talking about earlier, and is often, as you said, a response to a more polarized mindset of, of the active sort of discrimination. So
yeah, so it could be a method to say, well, everybody has it equal, so what's the problem?
yeah, it's better than polarization.
Right. All right. So then what came up around equity in your discussions, in your groups? Who would like to share about equity? We don't mind silence. So as Dustin said, sometimes it's needed.
Hi, I'm the Christina. So I just had a conversation in our group and related it to ergonomics. So we have ergonomics in workplace offices where we have no problem giving a mouse or a additional pad. Someone stands taller. I was a teller at banking, and that was very common and that was easy. That was a version of equity. So we're trying to give them something for them to do the same job as everybody else. And that's an easy thing to do. But when we look at our processes like applications and processes of hiring and interviewing, that's a different type of equity, and it requires more thought and it requires more effort than a mouse or a pad or something that you can tangibly buy, because it requires thought. And so equity is really important, and thinking about it is not just a tangible thing you can give them, it's your process of thinking.
Really nice. Thank you. Going back to what Dustin was saying around learn, think, and then act, right? And also around the visual that we might have seen, just to extend that of the people standing on the boxes or the crates looking over the fence and everyone getting the same size box. The extension on the equity side is giving people different size boxes, right? And that's a really helpful visual just to get to like the core difference between equality and equity. But the criticism of that is it's pretty simplistic. And the ergonomics example is also really interesting. I appreciate that, because you can think about how easily we often will give people different ergonomic equipment or basic things that seem pretty straightforward and not think about that as that is equity. But it's pretty simple in the range of equity. And lots of the other things where we struggle with equity are much more nuanced and complex and require a lot of thinking. So really appreciate that. Another definition or conversation around equity. What would anyone else like to contribute? Yes, right here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So we were talking about how equity is ensuring people have the resources and access they need to succeed from where they are. And thinking about, and this was kind of alluded to or spoken to already, but equity being systemic and it's about processes versus equality being more like behavioral, about treatment and kind of individuals. So it's just like different levels of thinking to the two.
Yeah, excellent. Really great. What one more? Any other thought? There's a couple of hands. We can go to both of you. Happy to go to both of you.
We talked about equity requiring an understanding of the individual. And then also for some neurodivergent people that we may have in our staffs that it's not visible to us. So it requires an even more in-depth understanding of their needs.
Yeah, for sure. So equity is more difficult, right? Because it requires more relationships, more information, more thinking, more slowing down, all the themes that we've already talked about today. There was one other comment in the back there.
I see equity versus equality. If like we like to pretend in the United States that a rising tide lifts all boats. But if you're in locks and one boat is down here, and one boat is up here, if you put in the same amount of water, the same input, then they're going to raise, but they're still going to be that same distance. Whereas if you put more water in the lower dock, like you're supposed to, it can go to the next dock.
Thank you so much for saying that example. That's a wonderful example. It makes me think about all the old sayings like rising tides lift all boats. There's plenty of those types of sayings that we were all taught maybe when we were little, all from different cultures. But if we're in dominant culture, and particularly in our whiteness, some of those, we should be very suspicious of every single one of those statements. Every time I hear one of them, I'm like, oh, now that I think of this with a different lens, when I think of it with an equity lens, ooh, problematic. So, and sometimes they come out of my mouth. I'm like, wait a minute, that's not good. So yeah, I really appreciate you bringing and lifting up the rising tide lift all boats, because that's a very suspicious one just for the reasons that you described. Really great. Okay, so yeah, think about really great definitions of equality versus equity, and equity being much more nuanced, requiring relationship, requiring understanding what people need. And you can only understand what people need if you're asking them and talking with them and building relationships with them. And so that's another differentiation when I think about it as outcome versus input. So equality is everyone gets the same input. Equity is that we're striving for everyone to have the same outcome, and the inputs may be different based on what people need. And this is all over the place in our workplaces. That we have designed policies and practices, we've designed our culture primarily around equality, let's at least hope, as our baseline. That's certainly not the case in some places, but we'll assume equality as a baseline, and what we're striving for is equity. Because you can see that if you look at, based on our history, as Dustin was saying, understanding our history and the systemic nature of oppression in our history, particularly in the United States, that we're all not coming into the workplaces with the same needs based on our history. And so if we don't acknowledge that, we are perpetuating inequity. So what I'd love to have you do at your tables now, I promise you're going to be talking to each other again, is I want you to do a little mini equity assessment. Now and this is mini for sure, but it's starting to get you some practice of thinking about this equity versus equality concept, but actually applying it, because we can all talk about it in concept, but it's really important to apply it. So lots of organizations go through a process, hopefully go through a process of doing an equity assessment. So they decide that they want to determine what practices and policies and elements of their culture may need more of a movement towards equity. And that requires some analysis, some thinking, some pausing, some slowing down. And so what we're going to ask you to do at your table, and this will be the part that I'm going to ask you to do quickly, is just to pick one process or practice at any organization. You can think about it as recruiting or performance reviews or the way that we do our annual meetings, anything that happens generally in an organization. And you will all have a similar process that happens in your organizations. Just pick one of them. The first person that says it, that's the one you'll go with. Okay. And then start to think about two questions. So just take notes to write these two questions. Who does that policy or practice benefit? And who does that policy or practice potentially harm? Who does that policy or practice benefit? And who does that policy or practice potentially harm? This is like a beginning set of questions on thinking about equity assessment. Now, you are in your table and having this discussion and answering these questions. What's important to note about when you're answering those questions and who's at your table? Especially about the second question. Anyone have any thoughts? Who is harmed? Anyone remember what was being shared by Liz before of the people that are pretty happy with where things are at? They might not say anything, they might not know, they might not care. This is working pretty well for me. Dominant, yeah. So just recognize if you are all white people sitting at your table, which I think is pretty much mostly the case, and is pretty much mostly the case because we're predominantly white in Maine, and you're asking the question, who is harmed by this? And no one else is at the table with you asking the question that is from a non-dominant or marginalized group, you can't answer the question. So I just want to make sure you don't, this is just an exercise. We don't have all the people in the room that need to be in the room. Okay, so you're going to pick one area in your company or organizations that you want to just analyze for just a moment, and you're going to ask those two questions and have a conversation. You're going to do that for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to bring the group back and we'll do a brief debrief and see what we've learned, and that will wrap up our session for today. So go ahead and get started. Let me know if you need help. All right, we're going to come back together. I know that felt short. It's just to give you a taste. We're planting seeds here. You could never solve an equity issue in this amount of time, but hopefully you got some good conversation going and started to learn from each other, which is really what the point is. So I'm just going to ask to hear from some thoughts like we did before from some tables of what came up, maybe what your area was that you focused on as a practice or a policy, and what some of the conversation that emerged around the equity issues within that policy or practice that we can all learn from because it probably applies to all of our organizations. Who would like to start? Who would like to share? There's a really confident hand over there. Thank you so much.
And then we go over there. Yes.
Excellent.
We spent our time talking about orientation,
Mm.
and I think there was a really great point brought up by the Christina here, which I'm going to forever call her now. But it really, we give a lot of information telling people what they can expect. This is how we do it. This is who we are. And we don't create that theme we've heard here, which is how do we invite people to help create that culture with us right from day one?
Mm. Beautiful. Oh my gosh. What an insight. Thank you so much. The Christina's table. Much appreciated. I think we have one of the mics back there, maybe?
I don't know. We're in a bit of a fight back here.
Oh my goodness. Excellent.
I tried to get some to do this, but we decided to go with job descriptions, how
Excellent.
they're written.
Yeah.
So I think the benefit is the employers believe that they write them to benefit themselves. And who's being harmed is workers that may have the skills, but don't exactly realize how they read it. They think we don't belong. In
Yeah.
reality, they do. So,
Yeah. Great point.
but like you said, 10 minutes was not enough. We just barely got into it. So
Yeah, no, but that's a continuation. Job descriptions, major opportunities for equity in terms of language, in terms of what's on there, and double checking again with this theme of question everything. Lots of stuff that's been put in job descriptions has just been transferred over time. Like, why is that an education requirement? Do we really need that as the education requirement? What are some transferable skills from other places? We do a terrible job figuring out how to transfer experience from other places in the world to the United States, a terrible job. And so there's tons of opportunities to be creative in job descriptions. So I love that topic. That's really important. I heard someone up here, and then was there anybody else still in the back?
Saw your hand. You want to go right now?
Okay, and then we'll come to you, Michelle.
We talked about employee functions or outings, dietary restrictions, holidays that may include dietary restrictions, as well as like, is parking accessible? Is it only stairs to get up to where your holiday party is or anything like that?
Really important considerations. Yeah, those are excellent points.
Where was the hand that was
right?
in
Oh, right
this
here.
area?
You and Dustin are
Oh,
competing.
We're in a race. You win.
Hi, we talked about the application and interview process. So organizations that only offer an online application and no paper application, or vice versa, or requiring applicants to come into the office to fill out an application, and maybe they don't read or write, and applications that only come in one language. And then also the interview process. Do you offer interpreters to help translate for non-English speaking workers? And so, those are barriers. And who does it harm? It harms non-English speaking workers. And who does it benefit? It benefits people who only might speak one language.
Thank you so much. The recruiting process, I heard multiple tables talking about the recruiting process, ripe for equity considerations for sure. And those are great examples provided. I even think about, for me, when I'm trying to do something on my phone, which is sometimes I try to stay away from my computer because it feels like I'm working. So if I'm doing something personal, I'm kind of doing it on my phone. And there's so many things that are not optimized to be used on the phone. And many people don't have computers. And so if you have applications that you haven't considered, how does it work on the phone, or how does your process, your applicant process work on the phone? There's a huge equity opportunity there. I think we have, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So we talked about performance reviews and performance management. And
big.
when getting into the questions about equity, it was around what is it being used for? What's the purpose of it? And something that Mark brought up that I thought was really astute, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it's basically if an assessment method for an employee is not equitable, it's not achieving the intended results of like what's being measured, which I thought was really, really insightful. And then Jeremiah also brought up that it tends to be like a one-way communication. So that's like another dynamic of this. So really interesting where there's not just this clear black and white of like who's being benefited and who's being harmed, but like how it's taking place.
Yeah, that typical hierarchical, I'm going to tell you and deem what you're good at and bad at, and then we will part in the typical performance or traditional performance review process, where there is an opportunity to make it two-way and an opportunity to say, what do you need? Which is the most important question around equity. And then being able to look at that across the organization to see how can you improve your equity, what you offer for equity, or how you embed equity in the organization across by gathering that information. So such a really important topic around performance reviews. I'd encourage you to think about, with all these people practices and practices inside organizations, first go to the ones that give people the most pain. And there are ones that give everybody pain. Dominant culture people like myself have pain over pretty much every one of these processes. They're all pretty awful that we've built, that I have perpetuated as a recovering HR person in a corporate environment. So think about the things that we say that we hate, and then imagine experiencing that if you're not from the dominant culture. And it's bad enough as it is. And it's so much worse. We have the power and control to influence these things. And I would say often, even when the people in power, in decision-making power, don't fully get it, as was being described by Liz before, I think of it as a hide your veggies approach. Like, we can build equity as HR professionals, as DEI professionals, in different ways that people who don't really fully get it may not understand that we're doing it. And it can be still culture changing and culture transformation. So takes some courage, but you can absolutely do it. And some of these discussions are really important to begin that process. So I'm going to open it up, unless anyone has any other important things you wanted to share about that last set of conversations. Just going to open, go ahead, one more down back there.
Oh.
Hey, Mary.
I think just to build off the recruiting and the performance, we were talking about compensation.
Yeah.
And so first of all, if you know that you're not supposed to be asked what you were paid before, right? And who that benefits or doesn't benefit. Do you know that you can actually negotiate your salary or not? Right. So there's some identities that are much better at negotiating than others, which then contributes to the inequity. And then when you get to performance management and you start to have merit conversations, if I negotiated my salary and that was accepted, yeah, I didn't bring the other group up when I made that decision to bring that person in at that pay. And then now I go into performance and I'm now giving that person a merit increase. It's just a great thread to talk about how one decision at the very beginning of an employee's experience can then thread all the way through their experience. So it's
and create continual inequity in so many different. Thank you, Mary. That's really awesome.
Oh.
The other thing I'll offer as one that doesn't often get touched, but is something for us to really consider in the HR and DEI spaces, is 401k plans. Pretty much built as the most inequitable thing that we have in organizations. Really happy to talk to you about that if you're like, huh? Because that is a little bit of a longer story. But when you think about wealth generation, which is what is supposed to be happening through 401k plans, and the inequity built into the design. So really happy to talk about that with anybody if you would like to after the session. Anyone have any broad questions or things that you want to ask any one of the facilitators before we wrap today? Any comments?
Just real quick, I'll add too. There's also, when we talk compensation, how we can steal people's time, because I get a lot of organizations that will ask for volunteers for committees, but don't pay. And I know paying volunteers, it's an oxymoron, but we'll basically ask people to do more, but at the same salary that we paid them.
Yeah.
So that's another big thing within inequity within work organizations, is to ask you to commit more time, but not pay you for that time.
Yeah, such a good point. We have a hand right behind you, Dustin.
You brought up a good point about benefits just from 401k, but I think that the way benefits were structured were for different people. Sitting in a group with bunch of different cultural heads talking about what they wanted from this one company. And the company just kept saying, oh, but we have paid time off and we have like this whole laundry list of things that was good for those folks that were promoting it. But the folks sitting, it did not resonate with, but there was no change in that. It was just more of like, you should know that this is good. This is what we want. I just didn't know if that was common, and how do you get at that piece of it?
I think that ties into minimization, right? That mindset of minimization. It's good for me, so it's good for everyone. Right. And so the invitation for folks in minimization is to do just what Dustin was talking about, and that is to learn more about diverse perspectives. And so that's the opportunity there to disrupt the certainty that they have that their experience is generalizable to all experience, or what they think is valuable is just the definition of valuable. How could anyone have a different definition? Right. Like you need to start disrupting that. I don't know if anyone else has
I'm
additional.
going to say the bigger system thing to talk about is how can you, when you talk about benefits, oftentimes organizations or companies will only go out to specific bidders for their benefits packages. Can you get information about multiple bids or multiple options? And I know this is radical, but we sometimes have an organization that only chooses the one, so that's all you get. But can you provide your organization with multiple options and say what would work best for you, and figure out what is the collective voice of how many different packages you should have? I know there's a cost benefit analysis to that, but I think that's the radical piece. Is too many times organizations just commit to one. This is what you get. This is your package. Enroll or don't enroll. And that's the danger of very binary type thinking. Yeah. That's my hand. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. We know that DEI work takes time. What suggestions do you all have in regards to helping individuals at our organization recognize that the perception that nothing's happening maybe is not true?
Couple of things. One, celebrate your victories, big or small. I think far too often, especially groups that I work with, we tend to just do something and then move on to the next problem, We become crisis or problem oriented. We never stop and sort of say, hey, let's talk about the good things we've done. Yes, we have things moving forward, but let's talk about the good things we've done. I'd also begin to work with folks to do timelines and expectations of those timelines. I think we often think, hey, we're going to have it all solved in 6 months. And then we're going to look back and it's going to be 6 months and go, hey, we didn't fix everything. I think you just need to be honest about the timeline. So a lot of the times I put forward year timelines. Hey, by the time we're done this year, these are the things that we are going to be able to accomplish, and be truthful about what you can accomplish based on capacity, staff, all those key pieces. Being upfront about that is better than assuming you can get it all done in 6 months and then get down to 8 months and go, well, what happened? So part of it is just transparency and setting the right timeframes for goals, and then celebrate when good things happen and just honor that. Slow down, take moments to honor that. Then you can move on to the next piece.
And I just really quickly add, because I'm sensitive to all your time, to riff off of what Dustin was just saying. There is what you can think of as leading and lagging indicators of success. And so often people are looking for what they think is supposed to be the end result, which is, we said we were doing diversity hiring and everyone still looks the same here, because that's the one that you hear all the time. Because that diversity hiring and having a diverse population is the thing that should take the most time, because you're supposed to be starting to work on your culture of inclusion before you're inviting people in and just saying, we want you here because your skin color is different. But people will visually say it's not happening. And so thinking about the first demonstration of success is that we have a diverse candidate pool. And that might be that we have diverse suppliers that we're using for search firms. And so there's like stages. So it's kind of what Dustin was saying around the time frame, but it's showing like people what's happening over the time and what has been successful in each of those milestones. In 4 years, we will have a diverse workforce here. So I think that's really important. Any other final thoughts or questions?
We have a question here.
Oh, good. Okay.
But I wonder if
We'll take this last one and then.
So talking about, different inputs to try to get the same outcome from people and compensation packages and benefits, how do you navigate that when you're working in a union environment?
The hardest question at the end when we have little time. So I would agree if anyone wants to stay, because I don't want to, I know union environments impact some folks, but not necessarily a lot in Maine. So if anyone wants to stay and huddle with the presenters up here to try to answer that question, we absolutely will. But we also want to let the rest of you get to your next session on time. And so please enjoy your day. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for your questions.
Thanks, everybody.